morning, my dear gamers. Longzy Buddy here. I know Mashu isn't narrating this video, but it's only for testing purposes. Well, whatever the weather, today we will be doing another review, this time on a Super Mario Jakks specific playset. Today we will take a closer look at the Switchback playset. Mashu got this one on a Children's Day sale, and it's the first proper playset he has. The box has a nice style to it, with the front having a clear picture of the set in action. Mashu is a massive fan of the top of these boxes. Reason? I'm still not sure somehow. The back has some more detailed information about the product, with some features and a description. The other sets are obviously sold separately. Here's the set complete. But it's better to look at all of the components individually. Let's check it out. First, the main man himself, Super Mario. This is just a standard figure of Mario, with no special details. To add insult to injury, this isn't the late 2023 update of him with some more parts he can pose like the legs. Because of that, the only points of articulation he has are the arms and head. Be prepared to see more of this exact figure in the far future. Next, the bullet bill. Just a standard bullet bill with nothing of note. Although, there is an extra part that goes onto his back. This is so that the bullet bill can be attached to the background of the set. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The set itself is connected to two base pieces. These bases have pegs where you can place the included accessories and holes for you to plop in the background piece. The same system is used in most other normal sets sold, so mixing and matching is very much allowed. I like this feel of creative freedom. One accessory is the bullet bill cannon. The cannon itself has two spots for you to put bullet bills in. It also tilts a slight bit, but it isn't something really used. The second one is a platform. It uses the cloud-like tile set, and it's hollow on the back. At the very least, this gives you a nice look into that peg connection. The third is an elevating platform. In the games, when a player, item, or enemy steps on it, it moves on its shown direction. If anything leaves it, it will come back the opposite direction with a changed color. In this case, it's only showing one color, one direction, and it makes a loud clackety sound when you move it. Note that you can only move this one up or down. The background has two spots for you to put some accessories, and that section for the included bullet bill. One of the upper pieces is a question mark block. It has a spring-loaded coin ready to pop out. Mine has a bit of a small factory fault with the plastic, since it's harder for the coin to pop out. The second one is another platform. While it uses the same tile set, it's only shorter and slimmer compared to the ground platform. The bullet bill with the extra piece fits nicely to that background. This gives the bullet bill the game-accurate gimmick of moving side to side. Similar to that elevating platform, a similar loud clackety sound is here as well. So that's the Switchback playset fully reviewed. Mashu said that he liked the game-accurate pieces, like the bullet bill gimmick, and the specific tile sets used for the platforms. Review-wise, the set has a great value for money too. With a $20 price tag, you are essentially paying for 4 figures. Here you get 2 of them with a full set that has some nice components to it. It's almost like a great starter set. So with all of that said, does Mashu recommend this set? I hear yes. Yeah. In terms of a star rating, this isn't getting half a star. Mashu gives this one a full star. Amazing job, Jakks. I guess I will wait until Mashu says that he wants to review another set. So, I will see you all next time. Bye, Longzy Buddy members.